by a Greek in the Roman Empire named Hero. And he's better known as a mathematician, but he actually developed a very crude steam engine. It was a metal ball with two spigots counterposed on a little spool, and it was filled with water, or halfway with water, and he heated it up, and it spun. Now, the Romans, when he took this to the Roman authorities and suggested this could be used for locomotion, they laughed at him. Said, "We have sleighs, we have wind. Why would we need a steam engine?" So we jumped 1,700 years to 1711, and roughly 17 centuries, and a fellow named Thomas Newcomen in Great Britain actually invented the steam engine, the original one that ended up being, of great use in the Industrial Revolution and launched us on our way for modern times. And the reason I tell that story, which has nothing to do with genetics or anything to do with health, is the Romans did not know what to do with this invention, but the British did. And that's the space that I find most fascinating right now. We have actually produced an extraordinary amount of discoveries and brilliant, brilliant technologies. And we're actually churning this out almost as an industry now with all the money being spent. Places like the Cleveland Clinic and the NIH and out in my neck of the woods in San Francisco, UC Berkeley where I am, and San Francisco and other places. The question is, what are we going to do with it? And are we going to make use of this? So in the book, Genes, Environment, Brain, and Body, one of the most critical factors of making this transition is, can we integrate all of this into something that's actually useful for people? And to describe the experiment here, I spent time with about 250 labs and companies that tested me. And many of them have discoveries that are ready to go. With a little funding, with a little effort, they could be useful for people, because most of what I was tested for is in a prototype or early phase and is not yet ready for prime time. And I also, just to give you some of the rundown, at the beginning of the book, I completely ripped off Harper's Magazine's Harper's Index, and I have the Experimental Man Index. But some of the overview there is I had about 2 liters of blood drawn. I don't really recommend that to anyone. I spent 22 hours in an MRI scanner, and I really don't recommend that. That's unbelievably boring, just laying there on your back for 22 hours. I also had 320 chemicals tested in that body burden study I mentioned. Like I said, dioxins, PCBs, things like that. Over 100 gigabytes of data, and that was mostly the MRI scans, which take up a lot of space in the computer. So, give you a couple examples of the experiment. The book starts with me catching a fish. Again, boy, he's talking about steam engines, and now he's catching a fish. When do we get back to the health? But I started with that to illustrate basically some of this linkage that I'm talking about that needs to happen among these different factors to give us a more complete version of ourselves and our future in predictive medicine. So I went out off the coast of California, and I caught a halibut. Went with a local fisherman, a guy named Josh Churchman, and he basically talked the whole time, but I did catch a fish too. And I went back and had that halibut for lunch. And then I bought in a store a swordfish steak that was also caught on the Pacific Ocean. And I did what's called a fish gorge. And this is a test to determine how much mercury basically is in these fish. And if you eat a very large fish, basically mercury comes mostly from fish, from our diet. And it gets in our fish by coal-burning power plants. And while we've reined that in somewhat in North America and Europe, you can actually see on satellite images, and if I had an image here I'd show you, you can see pollutants coming across from Asia now and falling over the Pacific Ocean where I live. And that includes mercury, and it actually gets into the food chain and moves up. So the larger the predatory fish, the more mercury, because it's eating smaller and smaller fish. So anyway, I purposely ate rather large fish to see what my mercury levels would be. And I went from 4 parts per billion in a before and after test, and the safety level being about 5.8 according to the EPA. So you don't want to go over that level. I spiked from 4 parts per billion to 13 parts per billion with just those 2 meals. Now this is still a tiny, tiny trace amounts, parts per billion, and most of these chemicals, when you get these levels, are so tiny that until recently they were virtually undetectable, some of them. And no one even really knows what these small levels mean, and there needs to be a lot more testing. But that's part of what the book is about, because even if you go to the genetics, much of our genetic heritage, our evolution, was designed by the organisms that led to us and to humans themselves to deal with environmental issues. You know, UV rays from the sun, even things like stress, fear, you know, all of the different chemicals that are out there. So what I did was I got that baseline level. Okay, so you eat a lot of fish, you get a lot of mercury. And that in itself is interesting and worthy of further study. Partly, do we really want that much mercury floating around in our fish? Although I do want to hasten to add here to eat fish, because fish is great for you, but you might want to consider not eating large fish, at least not too much. Smaller fish have much smaller levels of mercury. So I took this another step. I actually, since I had myself genotyped, I forgot to mention I had about 7 million genetic markers tested. Not a full sequence, but it was enough. I guarantee you it was enough. 7 million is plenty. So I took my sequencing data and I looked up all the existing studies out there on mercury sensitivity. And I found that there are dozens of genetic markers that suggest sensitivity or protection in animals, only about 13 in humans that have been discovered. And many of this is very, much of this data is very preliminary. But I, because I had my sequencing, I checked myself out. Do I have these genetic markers which suggest I might have some sensitivity to mercury? Mercury, by the way, tends to stay in most people about 30 or 40 days. And the body flushes out these chemicals at varying rates. Some of them are with us our whole lives. Some of them are with us just a few hours. It depends on the chemical and our physiology and ridding ourselves of these chemicals. Mercury, 30 to 40 days for most people. And the type of mercury that we get from the fish tends to settle in our brains. So this is not something that you want to have sticking around up here in the brain. So it's good that it flushes it out quickly. Unfortunately for some people, it does not flush it out as quickly. And some people who are tested in this, a small percentage of humans actually retain mercury much, much longer, sometimes as much as 180 or 190 days. And this is, again, getting into very preliminary research, but that suggests a genetic factor, that some people are not able to rid themselves of this toxic metal as well as others. And that's what these preliminary studies, the genetic studies, are suggesting. And some of them have to do with a chemical called glutathione, which is produced by cells. And this chemical is there in part to rid your cells of these toxic metals and other chemicals. And it appears that some genetic variations, and genetic variations, by the way, when I say that, I know some of you know this, but we're all born with a blueprint of genes, and most of it is identical in all of us in this room. But a few of them, probably a few million genetic markers, are different in us. And it makes us have blue eyes or brown eyes or tall or short. And in this case, it's responsible for producing this chemical, glutathione, that flushes out mercury. And so certain variations of this, somebody out here might have a different variation than me. You might have the protective one, but I have one that makes me sensitive. And I don't produce as much of this chemical as you do. So I don't rid myself of the mercury as fast. And that's what the Experimental Man Project is really all about, is trying to determine what's going on with beginning to link together things that are meaningful to us as organisms, if you will. And I discovered, at least initially, that I had the normal variations, which mean I have the normal flushing out of mercury, if in fact that's even accurate. That science is telling me that. Later, I discovered, though, upon further analysis, I actually have 2 that make me sensitive to mercury. And it's not a big deal for me because I don't even really like big fish all that much. But you can see in the future, and I said this is a glimpse into the future, right? The postcard from the future. Probably, I hope within 5 or 10 years, we'll be starting to have tests that are actually meaningful for each of us. And we can find out if it's safe for us, especially women of childbearing age and small children who are most affected by mercury. You might have a test that could actually tell you whether you could safely eat fish. And even if it's somewhat sketchy, it could give you a good idea of what's going on. So anyway, I spent a lot of time on the genes. I was also tested for lots of diseases. And as a healthy person, not surprisingly, I came out with low or moderate risks. I did come up high risk for heart attack. And I tested, as part of the project, my entire family.